Washington Journal continues.
David Kramer, what's the story of Tunisia as far as freedom in the world? What's the narrative there?
This is the first time an Arab leader has been forced from power. And this is, I think, a huge development. What we have seen in Tunisia is that President Ben Ali, after protests rose up starting in the middle of December, felt that he could no longer rule, and so he felt he had to flee the country. And this happened without massive violence. There were estimates of several score killed during protests and actions taken by security services. And the key now will be to make sure that there is a peaceful democratic process that's put in place with elections and good governance, and a new government that will finally respect the Tunisians' ability to express themselves freely, to participate in the political process, for journalists to be able to report. Those things have been deprived of the people of Tunisia under the previous regime.
I was going to ask what specifically led to these kind of specific events led up to what we saw last night?
Initially, it started in December when a young unemployed man set himself on fire and killed himself. He was protesting the state of the economy. He was unemployed, and he was being harassed by the authorities, and that then triggered a whole number of protests and movements by the people of Tunisia that then went into the capital. And what we saw was a situation where the security services simply weren't able to control the situation. They did use violence against a number of people. About 60 people were killed. And the president of Tunisia tried to control the situation. He made promises that he would undertake certain democratic reforms, that he wouldn't stay in office beyond 2014. That wasn't good enough, and it reached a point yesterday where he felt he had to leave. And this hopefully will create new openings for the people of Tunisia and possibly even in the region. There was a person in Cairo who tweeted on this yesterday, and this was reported in the New York Times, and he said, "Every Arab leader is watching Tunisia in fear. Every Arab citizen is watching Tunisia in hope and solidarity," and I think that says it all.
One of the things you do with your organization, Freedom House, is look at the places of the world where there is a lack of freedom. Talk a little bit about what you found, a recent report on that. Generally, what are we finding as far as countries that are free or not free?
The report that Freedom House issues on freedom in the world is an annual survey. It was started in 1972. We survey 194 countries and 14 territories around the world. And what we found for the fifth consecutive year is that democracy is receding. There was a reduction in the number of democracies in countries that are deemed free from 89 down to 87. And this 5-year decline is a record for our survey. We haven't seen a decline this long since the survey's been launched. We also see a reluctance among democracies to push back on authoritarian regimes that are really trying to challenge the efforts to promote democracy in other countries around the world, not only within their own countries. And so I think that this report that was unveiled this week reflects some worrying trends.
As far as authoritarian regimes, you cite that China, Egypt, Iran, Russia, and Venezuela stepped up repressive measures.
Not only are they stepping up repressive measures within their own borders, but they're also more aggressive beyond their borders, and they're supporting other authoritarian regimes that don't necessarily always get in the news. We see China having certainly weathered the economic crisis much better than most other countries, providing economic assistance, financial assistance to prop up authoritarian regimes. When China invests in countries or offers assistance, it doesn't do so with human rights conditionality that the United States does. Russia supports Belarus and the dictatorial leader, Alexander Lukashenko in Belarus, and Russia congratulated Lukashenko on his rigged re-election last month. In Iran supports terrorist organizations. Iran tries to undermine other countries in the region. Iran threatens the one democracy we cite in the report, Israel. And Venezuela also is very active beyond its borders in trying to support non-democratic regimes in Latin America. These countries and these regimes rely on each other. They meet with each other. They consult with each other. They unite. They actually unite and come together much more effectively, unfortunately, than the democracies have in recent years.
What does that mean then for the U.S. in light of President Hu Jintao visiting here in the United States and meeting with our president? The recent treaty we signed with Russia concerning START, that was military, but other issues. What then does the U.S. have role since we have relations with these countries in question?
The United States has an obligation to stand for human rights, democracy, and freedom around the world, whether it's with China, whether it's with Russia, whether it's with any country. And what's important is the United States has interests in the security area. It has interests in economic and energy areas with countries. But the democracy and human rights interests should not be shortchanged. It's like a three-legged stool. Security is fine, economic and energy issues are fine, but democracy and human rights should not be the shortest leg of that three-legged stool. So with the upcoming visit of Chinese President and Secretary General of the Communist Party of China, Hu Jintao, according to the Washington Post today, President Obama is planning to raise a number of human rights issues with him. Secretary Clinton delivered a speech yesterday at the State Department in which human rights featured rather prominently in her speech. The president met with some Chinese experts and activists on Thursday. So I hope this is a reflection that human rights will in fact be a prominent issue during the visit.
Is that a change in tact then?
When President Obama went to China in November of 2009, he was roundly criticized for not raising human rights issues during that trip, for allowing the Chinese to orchestrate his visit, for a really orchestrated press conference. It really wasn't a press conference. Secretary Clinton, remember, in February 2009, when she was traveling in Asia and then on her way to China, was quoted as saying, "We can't let those human rights issues interfere with the rest of our agenda." I think what we're seeing now is a change. I hope it reflects a sustainable change where human rights are going to get addressed, because China is one of the worst abusers of human rights in the world. It cracks down on dissidents. Look at the reaction of the Chinese government to the Nobel Peace Prize Committee's decision to grant the award to Liu Xiaobao, and it strongly condemned that decision. It pressured other governments not to attend the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony. President Obama issued a good statement when the award was announced, but there was precious little solidarity with Norway, which was coming under attack by the Chinese. When the Chinese started canceling high-level meetings with the Norwegians, other democracies didn't stand by Norway.
David Kramer with Freedom House. He's their executive director. We'll talk about world freedom and decline as they see it through research that they've done. We'll talk a little bit more about that. If you want to ask him questions, here's how you can do so. For Democrats, 202-737-0002. It's 202-737-0001 for Republicans, and 202-628-0205 for Independents. Journal at cspan.org is the email. CSPAN-WJ is our Twitter address. Do you find that it takes revolts like we've seen in Tunisia to really make these changes happen in a general sense?
In some cases. I mean, we think back just 5, 6, 7 years ago to the color revolutions in the former Soviet Union in Ukraine and Georgia, and a little less so in Kyrgyzstan. And the hope is that you don't need violence and you don't need overthrow of regimes, that regimes will come to understand that violating human rights, suppressing their populations, going against minority groups, that creates the very instability that they're trying to prevent. Secretary Clinton gave a speech in Doha just a few days ago, in fact, the day before the events in Tunisia. And if I can, she said, "Those who cling to the status quo may be able to hold back the full impact of their country's problems for a little while, but not forever. If leaders don't offer a positive vision and give young people meaningful ways to contribute, others will fill the vacuum." And that was rather prescient, since the day after her speech, we saw what happened in Tunisia.
Does Tunisia offer some examples in the fact that many of the people in the country are young people?
It does. Tunisia has a population that's well educated. Education was one of the areas that the government had invested in. It's a population of a little over 10 million. And I think what we saw was that the population was driven by frustration with the economic situation, with unemployment, but they were also very bothered by the corruption of the regime. And in fact, in the WikiLeaks that had been released, there were cables from the U.S. Embassy that were exposing massive corruption by President Ben Ali and his family. I think the people of Tunisia already were aware of that, but it shone even more light to the situation, and I think that also contributed to what we saw happen.
The report you put out for Freedom House comes with a map, and this map comes with various colors.
Yes.
I'd like to show the folks generally just the map at home. Could you explain, there's green, yellow, and purple. What do those mean? Sure.
The green countries are the free countries around the world, and there are 87 countries that Freedom House deems as free, and that constitutes about 43% of the world's population. Then you have the partly free countries, which are the yellow. Those are 60 countries, and that constitutes about 22% of the population. And then the purple countries, and in particular you can see in Russia and in China, which constitute the biggest chunk, but also in the Middle East too. Those are 47 countries with 35% of the population. Half of that is the Chinese population of 1.3 billion people.
What factors do you have to look at to determine how a country changes?
Political rights and civil liberties, and it's a very good question, because we don't necessarily evaluate countries based on what the governments do. That obviously factors into our assessments. But what we do is we do an on-the-ground assessment of the state of political rights and civil liberties: freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of association, civil liberties, in the electoral process, the ability for people to choose their leaders in a free and fair fashion, to have a representative parliament, an independent judiciary, an independent media. All of those things come together. There are some 23 different factors in the assessments. It's a very rigorous process that colleagues of mine, led by Arch Puddington, the Director of Research in New York, undertake. I attended 2 of the review sessions in New York. I was really struck by the rigor in which the authors of the reports, as well as analysts and consultants we have, go through each and every country that's in the report. 194 countries, 14 territories, and we make sure that we do the best job possible in rating countries based on political rights and civil liberties, and then based on the scores they get, that determines the color they get.
And those lenses germane to the United States, so when you look at these other countries, can other countries say, well, how can you look at it from our perspective when we have different perspectives?
Because what we do is we base this on universal values, not American values, and it's also a very important point. These are universal values, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as other bodies and organizations that countries belong to, whether it's the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the Council of Europe, the Organization of American States, the African Union, where a number of these organizations have charters that lay out basic human rights principles, and those are also guides for us when we undertake our study.
Calls lined up for you with our guest, David Kramer of Freedom House. He's their executive director from Otana, Minnesota. Apologies. You're first up. Chris, Independent Line. Go ahead.
Yes, it's pronounced Owatonna, Minnesota.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm calling to say, with all due respect to the gentleman, that it is true what you guys are saying. The world freedom is in decline, and that includes here in the great United States of America. I don't see how we have the right to talk about civil liberties and freedom and all that junk when every single day they do something with the Constitution to change the amendments on it. And number 2, we do rendition and torture and all that and never hold ourselves accountable. Our government is corrupt. So how do we have the right to talk to the whole world what is true and correct when we don't even follow the rules ourselves? That is my question to the gentleman. Thank you and have a good day.
Thanks very much for your question. Two points, if I may. First of all, Freedom House is not an arm of the U.S. government. We're an independent organization. We're a nonprofit organization headquartered in Washington. We're bipartisan. We've been around since 1941. This is our 70th anniversary. So we aren't representing the American government or the American government's position. Second, no country is perfect by any means. The United States is no exception to that. But I would argue that the United States, for all the mistakes and faults, has corrective measures in place where if the government undertakes certain measures, there are ways to try to stop that, correct it. There are checks and balances built into our system that are lacking in many other systems. One other point, if I may. Just because the United States is not perfect doesn't mean that many people around the world, human rights activists, democracy defenders, don't look to the United States for moral support, for solidarity, even financial support in some cases. They look to us to stand up to authoritarian regimes, and I think that has stayed the same regardless of the ups and downs we may have in our own country.
We have someone off of Twitter who's astute at looking a map. This is Donna, who asks, what's the free country in the middle of Asia? And I think she means that's green. Is that Mongolia, she asks?
Yes, I believe it is.
And why is it so?
Mongolia has a checks and balance system in place. Mongolia is a country where political rights and civil liberties are respected. It's a huge country geographically. It's a small country in terms of population, but it does stand out in the region because it does have a system in place where officials are elected, where the media are independent, and where activists are allowed to engage in whatever kinds of activities they want without any pressure from authorities.
Sacramento, California, Mani, Republican line.
Yes, sir. Thanks for taking my call. Yes, sir.
Yes.
I would like to ask you 2 questions. First question is, hello?
Your answer. Go right ahead.
Yes. First question. We have a guy in Ivory Coast right now has lost election, and it's been more than a month. I think it's been more than a month. This guy is still in power. My question is, what can the West do to speed this guy? To speed things up, to get this guy out of there? Because this kind of stuff, they're creating this kind of problem for the region, especially the people who are vulnerable, like Africans. Second, we have a country like Ghana. I'm a Ghanaian American. Ghanaians have demonstrated that this democracy can work, and yet you don't see the West trying to promote Ghana so that this kind of thing, democrats can transpire to the region. The West is failing Ghanaians because the same thing that you are preaching, you are not promoting. Ghanaians have tried to promote this thing, and yet the West is not backing them up. You need to promote Ghana so that the rest of the leaders in the region can see that if you are become Democrat, we are behind you. Can you answer my question, please?
Sure. No, thanks. Great questions. On Ivory Coast, you're absolutely right that it is a bad situation where the incumbent president refuses to recognize an election that led to his defeat, refuses to cede power to the victor in that election. A few positive developments, though, I would argue, is that the countries of West Africa have united and have been pressuring the incumbent president to leave. He hasn't left yet. The United Nations has also taken a strong stand, including defending the elected president. And I think there has been a strong stand taken by African leaders, by the United Nations, by the United States and Europe, where they recognize that it is very important for African leaders who lose elections, they need to step down and turn over power. We've seen problems in Zimbabwe, we've seen problems in Kenya, where the outgoing or the incumbent leaders refuse to leave. And I think African leaders have come to discover that is a huge problem. And if they don't take a stand, as they're doing in Ivory Coast, then there will be further problems throughout the continent. The problem is not solved yet. There has been violence, but I think it is positive, at least, that there has been a strong stand taken by African leaders. On Ghana, your point is an absolutely fair one, which is that it is incumbent upon democracies around the world to help the fragile and new democracies that are developing. There are programs such as the Millennium Challenge Corporation that was launched in the Bush administration, that is continuing in the Obama administration, that try to provide support to nascent democracies that also are governing justly. That is a criteria for receiving support from that. So it's very important that the more experienced democracies of the world come to the assistance of the new democracies, because if new democracies fail in delivering on the economic standards of their country, standards of living, economic improvement, then those new democracies could soon change colors on our map.
Well, you can't talk about the whole context of the report, but you can check it out for yourself. It's available on their website of Freedom House. freedomhouse.org is the site. Tell us, besides the report, what kind of information about what you do can our viewers find?
Sure. As I mentioned in response to the first caller, Freedom House has been around since 1941. We were founded by Eleanor Roosevelt and Wendell Willkie. They were our honorary co-chairs. We are a bipartisan organization, which is to say our board of trustees is bipartisan. We're a nonprofit organization. We're headquartered in Washington. And we also have an office in New York. We have 10 offices overseas. Our mandate is to support freedom and human rights and democracy around the world. We do it through reports that we issue, such as the one we've been talking about this morning. We do it through programs that we also undertake with supporting human rights activists and journalists, democracy advocates. We also engage in advocacy work, whether it's in support of freedom of expression, freedom of association, working with governments, including the U.S. government, with the Congress, with international organizations, with foreign governments, in trying to raise awareness about human rights issues around the world.
One of the things I read this morning was the use of Twitter and other social media, especially when it came to Tunisia.
Yes.
What does that play a role in, as far as you see it in the future of how these countries might change?
Absolutely, and I think we've been seeing that not just in Tunisia. We saw it in even a small country like Moldova in 2009 in response to a rigged election in April of 2009. People were text messaging each other, sending SMSs. We've seen it in other places. We see it in China. And I think the new communication has become an important tool for human rights activists and democracy supporters to be in touch with each other, to exchange best practices, whether it's blogging, whether it's SMSing, whatever the means, tweeting, Facebook, all of these things are terrific new features and tools to help advance the cause of human rights and democracy.
Detroit, Michigan, you are next for our guest, David Kramer of Freedom House. Democrats line. James, good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Kramer. I'm very concerned about American democracy, particularly given the resurgence of conservatism here in America. The Republicans were just reinstated as the majority in the House of Representatives. The United States Supreme Court in Citizens United voted to restore, or actually to boost, businesses' ability to control voting in this country by allowing them to donate as much money as they can to control our electoral process. I am concerned that suffrage, being a major pillar of any democracy, the people's ability to get out and vote for their preferences is going to be controlled by big business, by conservative forces in this country, which actually want to see a minority, a small group of people, control the majority.
I think that the caller is registering concerns that a lot of people have in this country. There are a number of people who would disagree. I think what we do have that's very important is we do have a political process where people are able to go vote for their local representatives, for national leaders. There is an independent judicial system that acts as a check and balance. And there are going to be ups and downs where people like the turn of events from the last election, others won't like them. That's why we have elections, so that if people don't like what happened in the previous election, they can go and try to advance a different cause.
James Ard adds this morning off of Twitter, instead of promoting majority rule democracies, we need to be encouraging constitutional republics.
There's no cookie cutter approach. Each country is going to develop in its own way, whether it's constitutional republics, whether it's electoral democracies. I tend to think electoral democracies are the best way because they ensure that leaders are accountable to the populations. And I think accountability is critical for good governance. It's critical for ensuring that human rights are respected for the populations. So I would respectfully disagree. I think constitutional, rather electoral democracies are proven to be the best system. We've seen over the years the number of electoral democracies around the world decline. It used to be 123 in 2005. It's down to 115 now. There was one drop just in the past year alone. Electoral democracies, I think, are really the best system. It reminds me of Churchill's quote, "Democracy is the worst, except for all the others." And so there's no perfect system. And each country, as I say, will develop in its own fashion, respecting its history, its culture. And what's important is, for an organization like Freedom House, we're not trying to impose a certain model on countries. We're trying to support indigenous movements in these countries that are fighting for human rights and freedom and democracy.
The report talks about a shift in Mexico. Why is that?
The Mexico downgrade from free to partly free has been a source of some controversy. Again, it is because of the state of political rights and civil liberties, and due to the extensive violence in Mexico, where we see journalists murdered and law enforcement officials murdered, as well as innocent civilians.
Because of the drug trade.
Because of the drug trade. It is the prevalence of violence in Mexico where it has had an impact on journalists, for example, ability to report on certain stories. You create an environment of self-censorship where journalists, out of fear, understandable fear, don't want to investigate and report on certain stories because they're afraid they'll lose their lives. So it is not necessarily a certain action that the Mexican government has taken. It is almost the inability of the Mexican government to control the level of violence there.
St. Petersburg, Florida. Thanks for waiting. Jim, Republican line. Go ahead.
How you doing? With all due respect, sir, I find quite a lot of holes in all the information that you give. I'm starting to think that this is total fiction of what you say. Maybe if you say in the U.S. freedom is declining, I would agree. But then you start talking about countries such as Venezuela, who's actually sponsoring authoritarian rule in other countries. That's just completely false. As a matter of fact, if you compare Venezuela to the U.S., you'll find the U.S. has had interventions every year of a multitude of different countries for the last 70, 80 years.
I guess I'll have to respectfully disagree with the caller. On Venezuela, you have President Chavez, who has shown no respect for the elections in the fall of last year that produced a very strong turnout for the opposition. And after those elections, he used the old parliament to ram through emergency powers where the new parliament that will come in won't have the ability to block those powers. Chavez has gone after critics, gone after opponents, gone after journalists and civil society activists. He supports the Cuban government. He is in close ties with the Russian leadership. He's traveled to Belarus. The company he keeps would strongly suggest to me that Hugo Chavez is not a Democrat by a long shot.
Washington, D.C. Ty on our Democrats line.
Yes, sir. First, I'd like to point out, as the last caller did, you failed to mention the coup d'etat that took place in Honduras, as well as one of the worst violators of human rights on the planet, Saudi Arabia. I'd like to take onus with what you said about at the very beginning of your statement about a democracy called Israel. Now, Human Rights Watch came out with their internationally respected report that called separate but unequal Israel's discriminatory treatment of Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories. Also, I'd like to point out that they said Palestinians face systematic discrimination merely because of their race, ethnicity, and national origin, depriving them of electricity, water, schools, access to roads, while nearby Jewish settlers enjoy all of these state-provided benefits. While Israeli settlements flourish, Palestinians under Israeli control live in a time warp, not just separate, not just unequal, but sometimes even pushed off their lands and out of their homes.
Caller, what's the question for the guest?
The question is, how can he keep Israel and Saudi Arabia, and I also say the 30-year dictatorship in Egypt, off his radar and call Israel a democracy when there are hundreds of thousands of Israeli Palestinians that live inside 48 Israel that are equally denied democracy, as well as the glaringness of the occupied territories.
Okay, thanks.
On Egypt and Saudi Arabia, just in the interest of time, I haven't mentioned them yet. Neither country is free. Their list is not free. Egypt had terrible parliamentary elections that were much worse than those in 2005. And I think we see a continued disregard by the Egyptian government for the will of the Egyptian people. Now what we also see is growing tensions between Christians and Muslims in Egypt, including a terrible terrorist attack on New Year's Eve of a Christian church. Egypt is, I think, a real concern for many who are trying to see Egypt move in a more democratic direction. Saudi Arabia also is among the worst in terms of human rights abuses and repression. So there's no question about those. I think the caller and I would agree on Israel. Certainly there are problems in Israel. I don't mean to suggest that Israel is a flawless democracy at all. It does have a system in place where the leaders are elected by the population, where there is a lively debate in Israel, where there is a lively parliament in Israel. And those things are also, I think, very important for looking at the situation there. I take the caller's point. The situation for Palestinians living in Israel is not good at all. And that's something we do also try to weigh when we do the assessment.
David Kramer is our guest with Freedom House. He is their executive director, with us for 10 more minutes. Our next call is on our Republican line. It's Ron from Las Vegas.
Yes, good morning, C-SPAN, and good morning, my fellow Americans. And David, you're a very smart man, and I know you can probably answer my question after I make a few comments here. I'm very, very concerned about the way our country is going. I believe we've been infiltrated at all levels of government by the socialist communists that said they would take over our country eventually by never firing a shot. And it looks like they have a lot of willing accomplices in the Democrat and the Republican Party. I call them rhinos and Republicrats that don't seem to be doing what I would do if I were in control at any level. I became active here in politics in 1992 when Ross Perot came on the scene. I knew something wasn't right, but Ross Perot talked about the giant sucking sound of our industrial base, and turns out nobody gives him credit. He was absolutely right.
So, caller, a question to our topic this morning?
Yes, President Bush, during that debate, mentioned three words that I can't shake from my mind. New World Order. It looks like it's being pushed by the Obama administration just because he's got all these czars in the White House. That's how bold they're getting in calling it this New World Order. And when you're number one, there's only one way to go, and that's down.
Look, I think the caller, when you contrast what the caller now just said to some earlier callers, reflects that the United States is full of different opinions and diversity. Some people are huge fans and supporters of President Obama. Others, like the caller we just had, are very, very critical of him. And I think that is what makes the United States a very vibrant country. And we have elections so that people can determine their leadership. And I think that's how this country has operated for many years.
Birmingham, Alabama. Joe, Independent Line.
I believe that the guess there is absurd. I've been to some of the countries that he mentioned, and for example, Moldova, they have a gridlock situation. There's a lot of ethnic tension there. They also have more political parties than we do. And when I watch the media there, I'm always informed. I can pick up BBC, I pick up CNN, I can pick up Russian media, I can pick up Romanian media. The people are more literate. Russia has over 40 political parties in its Duma, and it has more independent news outlets. It has problems for sure, but this guy has it ranked below Argentina. And, you know, it's just absurd. I'm calling you from a city in the United States that two of its last four mayors have gone to prison for corruption, that two of its last four governors have gone to prison for corruption. I believe that there's a bias, that this is what we're seeing on TV right now is just a relic of the Cold War. This person, you know, is just American-centered nonsense.
Yeah, I guess the caller and I are going to have to agree to disagree. The fact that the officials where he lives have gone to jail for corruption suggests to me that the system works. If officials engage in inappropriate behavior or illegal activity, there is a system in place that holds them accountable. In the case of the two countries you mentioned, Moldova, we have to be careful. The number of political parties a country has doesn't necessarily mean that it's a vibrant democracy. Moldova, I would argue, after events in 2009, has made progress, and in fact we reflect that progress in our report. They had elections in the end of November of last year. They do seem to be moving forward and putting together a coalition government. The government that they had before the latest elections also is making great progress in Moldova. So I know Moldova. I've been there many times. I used to work in the State Department and had responsibility for Moldova as well as for Russia. So I know the country well, and I think Moldova is moving in the right direction slowly but surely. Russia, here again, I think the caller and I will have to agree to disagree. Russia is a place where the government shows no respect for human rights. We've seen this with the verdict in the Khodorkovsky case, with the arrest of Boris Nemtsov, an opposition figure, sentencing for him, going to jail, murders of journalists and opponents of the Russian government, crackdowns against opposition activities, journalists who were afraid to speak out and report. I don't think there's any question that Russia belongs in the not free category.
Lexington, Massachusetts, Democrats line. Eileen, go ahead.
Good morning. I would like to get the focus back on the United States and torture. And Mr. Kramer keeps saying over and over that we have a system of checks and balances, that we can fix our government through voting. And we voted for Mr. Obama in 2008, and we voted for a constitutional lawyer. We thought he would engage in a comprehensive civil liberties upgrade of the United States. We have recently had a president, Mr. Bush, who wrote a book, who went around the United States bragging that he tortured people. He doesn't care. And show me how our checks and balances are working. Mr. Obama has continued rendition. He has targeted Al-Awlaki for assassination, an American citizen. He has kept Bradley Manning in solitary confinement, which I view as torture.
The caller, let me be clear. President Bush has not gone around the United States bragging about torture. He has defended waterboarding, which he felt was not torture, and many people do. And so there are different views on that. President Obama, one of the first things he came out and said and did when he became president was to say the United States would not engage in any torture, including waterboarding. He deemed waterboarding to have been a practice of torture. And so, but what President Obama, I think, has discovered, including with his promise to close down Guantanamo Bay, where a number of detainees after 9/11 have been kept, is that it's very difficult to do. There have been a number of detainees who have been transferred to other countries, but his task has been made more difficult by congressional officials who don't want these detainees to be tried in the United States. Or to be even detained in the United States. So President Obama, I think, is trying to do the best he can on these issues. And this was a campaign issue in 2008, where he was arguing that he would change a number of the practices that the Bush administration engaged in. And in certain cases, he succeeded. In other cases, it's proven to be more difficult.
Lafayette, Indiana is our last call. Republican line. Terry, go ahead.
Good morning.
Morning.
Say, I've got this article in my scrapbook out of the newspaper that said 75% of the people in the United States believe every state in the United States should have medical marijuana. Another article I have said that marijuana is the #1 selling illegal drug in the world. If it was legalized, it would hurt the mafia, street gangs, the cartels terribly.
And how does that pertain to our discussion, sir?
What's that?
How does that pertain to our discussion?
75% of the people, the Senate don't do like we want them to do.
Yeah, I guess this is an issue where I confess I haven't taken a position, nor has my organization, Freedom House.
As far as the map as we see it now, what do you expect as far as changes in the future, as how color changes, if purple is not free and yellow is moderately free and green is free?
Obviously, we want to see more green on the map next year. It will be interesting to see what happens in Tunisia in light of the events just in the past 24 hours and the past few days. It will be interesting to see what happens with a number of key elections around the world. Elections, though, aren't the only criteria by which we determine and judge democracies. Elections are a key part, but so is independent judiciary, a civil society that's very strong and active, and independent media. Those are all key elements for democracies around the world. They're not American features, they're universal features of democracy. And I think it's very important to understand that an organization like mine is not trying to advance the American model. What we're trying to advance are common features, universal features of democracy and human rights, and that's, I think, what everyone should want to see.
David Kramer of Freedom House, again, their website is available, a link to our website, and you can find the report and information related to it. Mr. Kramer, thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
Our last topic this morning takes a look at the Supreme Court as it revisits a case that looks at the use of search warrants. Our guest will explain it and what it means as far as the case is concerned. Oren Kerr of George Washington University, law professor there. He'll be right back.